Hello everybody, I'm Nat Coalson. I'd like to thank Epson UK and Wex Photo Video for inviting me to talk about the photography workflow from capture to exhibition. So for today's agenda, we'll just quickly go over my background so you can understand where I'm coming from with some of these things. We'll cover the digital photography workflow and the various steps that you'll need to take. We'll talk a bit about color management to ensure that your prints are the best that they can be in terms of color and tonality. I will spend a little time talking about how to choose the best media and paper for each image. And then we will definitely cover some of the printing workflow, including some key settings in your software as well as the printer driver. So I started my career working as a graphic designer in the late 80s, and by the early 90s I was really getting heavily into print. And at that time, some of the first photo quality inkjet printers were coming out. And I really fell in love with print. I mean, from the beginning, for me, it was really quite a joy to see a physical, tangible thing coming out of the computer. So flash forward a few years, and around 2003, I started my business in fine art photography. I had always really been into photography, but it wasn't until digital capture really became capable at a professional level that I decided to build my business around producing photography as fine art. So since then, I've done quite a lot of exhibitions. I've shown my work in every kind of venue and in all kinds of situations. And we'll talk a little bit more about exhibition towards the end of today's presentation. A couple of years ago, I opened my own gallery, which for a long time was kind of a dream and a goal of mine. And I finally found a great place to open it here in England. And Gallery Photique is my gallery of fine art photography, but we don't only show my own work. I do also represent the work of other artists. All along the way, I have taught, and I really enjoy teaching, and I've worked with groups of all sizes, and I also do quite a lot of private sort of one-to-one kind of instruction and mentoring for people. So my mission all along, from the very first days of my business, has been to produce photography as fine art, recognizing that photography has a lot of different potential uses and purposes, ranging from commercial to, things like that are much more personal, like weddings and family portraits and things like that. I really like to make pictures that are beautiful and inspiring and, serve to hang on the wall and enjoy as interior decor. So this is an example. When I was really first starting off in photography, I really envisioned doing most of my work in the outdoors and, shooting nature and landscapes. I grew up in Colorado, and in the American West, there are so many really well-known and iconic landscapes. And so, I followed in the footsteps of, people like Ansel Adams and, his group of photographers, trying to produce images of the very highest quality of, very natural scenes and subjects. So this is one of my early images in nature and landscape photography. This is White Sands National Monument in New Mexico. And the sun has just set, casting this really lovely glow across the landscape. I'm going to bring up this image and some of these others when we talk about choosing paper as well. So you'll see this again in a minute. Here's another landscape. I was fortunate enough on this occasion to be leading a workshop. I had a group with me up at the very right at tree line in the high country of the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. This is near Crested Butte. And this is a place aptly named Paradise Divide. And we had just witnessed a downpour, really. We had huddled in our cars as the sun was just starting to rise and wondering if there would be a break in the rain. And we got out and started setting up our cameras, and lo and behold, that we did catch just a small break in the clouds, and through it came this amazing rainbow with the reflection. So I'm really happy, that I not only that I was able to make this picture, but that a lot of my students and my workshop clients got their own versions of this as well. So as the years went on, my work, even shooting in nature and in outdoor natural settings, started to become more graphic, more abstract, really drawing upon quite a lot of my background as a graphic designer, and sort of a graphic artist, where I really enjoy kind of two-dimensionality. And so this is an example of, sort of the transition when I realized that I really was much more drawn to abstraction. And, although landscape and nature does fit very well and lends itself nicely to fine art, I also feel like that abstraction is one of those areas that, is kind of uniquely purposed, for as decor, right? Because as you look at it, it sort of gets your mind going, your imagination and your inspiration. You're kind of, thinking about what you're seeing, more than just a pretty picture. So as my work started to become more abstract, I started shooting more in urban environments and in, less in nature and sort of more in the built environment and the man-made world. And this is some of my more recent work. This is a reflection in a mirrored surface. It's a roof of a building here in the UK. And, I really love abstraction in the sense that it's not literal. It's sort of for each person to interpret it in their own way. And, it can become very personal. This is another roof or a ceiling, an interior ceiling of in the cellar of a hotel in Barcelona. And I was, again, fortunate enough on this occasion to be leading a private photo tour with some clients from the U.S. And we had stayed in this hotel for a few days. And this actually was downstairs in the breakfast room. And as we were having breakfast every morning, I kept looking up at this ceiling, just thinking how amazing it was. And these, years, decades and centuries even of really interesting layers of paint and this patina that had built up on this ceiling. So I asked for permission from the hotel management and went down and spent quite a long time, shooting all around the ceiling, literally just with my camera kind of pointing straight up. This is a picture that I've reproduced and sold many prints of over the years. This looks great on a metallic surface, which really picks up kind of the metallic character of the gold. This also is in Spain, although on a much later trip. This is a metal dish that I found just literally just laying on the ground in the woods as we were wandering around a property near where we were staying. And, again, it's got this kind of metallic quality to it. And so I print this really quite large on canvas usually. And this is one that I also enjoy embellishing the prints kind of one by one using metallic foil and acrylic, for bringing out the textures of the images. So my work, again, is very much about producing photography to be printed and reproduced as fine art. And so real quick, here's my gallery is called Photique in Leamington Spa in the UK. And, along the lines of photography as fine art, we are actually hosting a conference on the 17th of April, 2021. And the website here for Art Photo Conference is where you can find details and buy tickets for that. So real quick about gear. I mean, as you might imagine, the finished result is my primary concern. And, in all honesty, the gear is a relatively small element of my whole workflow. I mean, I do use certain camera systems and computers and printers because I find that they, give me the speed and the flexibility that I need and the ease of use, but also that I can reproduce things for the very best quality. And I have changed camera systems a few times over the years. Currently, I'm shooting with Sony mirrorless and very happy with the Alpha series full frame cameras. And I always prefer to work on Macs. I use a Mac Pro in my home studio and a MacBook Pro when I'm traveling. I'm a big fan and a believer in the software solutions from Adobe, and I've used Photoshop since it first came out, and also Lightroom when it was first released, around 15 years ago. And along the way, of course, I've tried and worked with all other kinds of software, but I find that between Lightroom and Photoshop that I can do everything I need. I can get the quality that I want. It's got the workflow. I do find that Adobe's solution works for me. Now, I mean, I suppose this is a good time to point out that a workflow, in general, is a very personal thing, and what I might recommend or what I say, the methods and the tools that I prefer and that work for me, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work or make the most sense for everybody else. So you do want to experiment enough and try a few different solutions, enough to the point where you're working with a set of tools that you can really master. I mean, that's the important thing. It's really key to not be, always jumping around from one thing to another and not ever truly mastering your tools, right? So it is a little bit tricky, to choose because there are so many options, but here's what I prefer. And to that end, of course, is Epson printers. And of course, over the years, I've worked with, fine art and inkjet and other types of printers from all manufacturers. And over the years, I really have always, found that I am very, very happy with the products that Epson produces. And so you can see here, this picture is the Epson P9500. I've got one of these at our studio. I also have an older 9890 44-inch large format Epson in my home studio. And I've also been working more recently with the SureColor P900, which is the desktop version. Really, really great printers. And I do print on a variety of media, whether it's, kind of a straightforward luster photo paper, or a fine art paper. I really, a lot of my images are well suited, for something, a little bit more, sort of soft and textured. Again, we will talk more about media in a little bit, but, I do enjoy printing on a range of substrates, especially canvas. A lot of my photos really look their best when they have a little bit of texture to them. So let's go over the digital photography workflow. Now, I should mention, before I forget, that I am going to be staying around for a chat at the end of this presentation. So if you have questions, you can enter them in below, and I will do my best to answer as many questions at the end as I can. We're going to be covering a lot of ground, and I realize that, in a session like this, that's, an hour or 90 minutes, that, we can't really get too deep into any one thing. So this is kind of a high level overview, but my hope is that it'll give you enough that you can build on, and that you can see how it all works together, and then, identify the areas, that maybe you need to work on a little bit more. So in terms of the workflow, we're always starting with a capture of one form or another. And, it doesn't matter whether you're shooting with your smartphone or, a high-end medium format digital back, or, a mirrorless or DSLR. I mean, you really can make good, interesting, compelling, and very expressive photographs using all of these types of capture devices. The key is learning to see and to understand how to create compositions and design your photographs in such a way, that regardless of what device you're using, that you are creating something that really speaks for you. So after you've made your capture, then you've got to download onto a computer, onto a hard drive, make a backup, at least one backup. I actually recommend to my students that we work with systems of at least 3 copies. So we have a working master files, which is kind of our day-to-day library of working images. Then we've got a working backup, which is updated at the end of every work session. So you got your master and then your backup to the master. And then the third copy is a set of archive images that would be updated less frequently and ideally kept off-site or somewhere away from your, from where your masters are. Think about 3 copies and one set is kept, at a neighbor or at a bank safe deposit box or, somewhere else. So after you've downloaded your photos onto your hard drives and made your backups, then the next step, number 3 in our workflow, is to organize them. This also traditionally would be, the role of photo editor, and long before we had the digital darkroom, the process of photo editing very much involved, going through a whole bunch of images, potentially hundreds or even thousands of pictures with digital, and then, picking out your best ones and sorting and organizing them, cataloging them, in a way. And so this organization process is something that you don't want to skip, or cut too many corners because, you can spend a lot of time, just trying to find things later if you're not well organized. After you've downloaded and organized everything and you've picked your best images, then that's when we start getting into processing. Now, by processing, I mean enhancing, adjusting, bringing out the tone and color, doing things like sharpening and noise reduction, all of these things that, today we're going to be talking specifically about the digital darkroom. But the idea here is that you want to be spending your time working on your best pictures. Life is too short to be, messing around and wasting time with pictures that aren't going to make the grade for one reason or another. So you want to get through your organizing first and pick out the very best ones. And those are the ones that go into your develop module in Lightroom or in Photoshop with your layered master files, etc. And of course, at this point, you're kind of working on each image one by one and trying to make each one the best it can be. So after you've then finished your master file and you can, call it done, you're happy with how it looks, then we get into the print workflow. And I've got a special section that we'll talk about that specifically. So starting with capture, you want to be capturing for the best possible quality because it's very difficult to know when you're out shooting, what you will end up doing with your photographs, unless, of course, you're shooting for a client or on assignment and you're working to a brief, and you may have some specs then. But even so, if you're working for yourself or planning to create fine art prints, you got to start out with the absolute best quality you can. And that means, composing very carefully. I do see a lot of photographers, especially in workshops and classes, thinking that, if you work quickly and, maybe don't get it just right or make some mistakes while you're shooting, well, you can always just fix it later. That is not really a mentality that you want to get into. It really pays to be trying to make your pictures the best that they can, in camera. Right? What you would like is that the pictures that are captured on your memory card are as close to finished and as close to perfect as you can get them, even before you start doing your digital processing. This means, when possible, always capture in RAW. That we don't have enough time to get into a long debate about the benefits of RAW. I think most of you probably understand by now that when you capture in RAW, you're going to get the most possible quality to work with, later in your workflow. If your camera cannot capture RAW, then at least you want to be setting your JPEG settings to the absolute best quality and the largest resolution that you can. Now, of course, there will be exceptions to this. We are talking fine art today, where the workflow is designed around quality and not speed. But I understand that if you're shooting a sports event or a wedding or something where you just need to hand off a set of files very quickly, that RAW is not always going to be ideal. But again, in the topic for today, talking about working to a fine art standard, RAW is definitely where it's at. Jumping ahead here a little bit, color spaces. Again, with RAW, because you have so much latitude in processing, it really doesn't matter what your camera color space is set to if you're capturing in RAW. But if you are capturing JPEG, then the color space does matter quite a lot. And if you're going to be printing for fine art, then you want to use Adobe RGB. If you are just going to have sort of standard lab prints made, then sRGB can be okay. And certainly if your images are only designed to be viewed on screen, for example, in social media or even for video use, then sRGB will be the best. But when we're talking about fine art printing, then definitely Adobe RGB if you're capturing JPEG. So with your exposures, with digital, you want to make sure not to underexpose. Now this means ideally you want to be really nailing your exposures perfectly when you can, using your histogram and your manual settings and whatever you need to do to try and ensure that your exposures are solid. If you can't nail the exposure, then you are better off in overexposing just very slightly as opposed to underexposing. Now this all has to do with the characteristics of digital capture, because when you underexpose, you're actually capturing less data, and that's going to give you less headroom and less ability to edit with high quality later. You want to be capturing the most possible data that you can, and that's why if you've ever heard about this idea of shooting to the right of the histogram, that effectively means just a very slight overexposure in order to be capturing as much data as you can. Again, because areas that are dark or underexposed or not brightly lit, those areas are not going to be recording a lot of data on the camera sensor. Of course, I'm not suggesting that you deliberately overexpose to the point that you're blowing out highlights, because that stuff is not recoverable. So if you are not able to nail the exposure, then just capturing maybe a third of a stop or just slightly over the metered exposure will give you the most data to work with. This kind of speaks to the topic of understanding your camera previews. And you got to know, especially when you're capturing RAW, that what you see on the camera is only so accurate. And most cameras are going to be showing you a preview and a histogram based on their JPEG processing, and not necessarily reflecting exactly what's in the RAW file. This goes some way to explaining why sometimes you'll notice that if you are using a histogram and you look at the camera histogram and then you look at the histogram later, say in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, you will see that there's a difference, and that the histogram actually is different because the rendering and the interpretation of that raw data is different on your camera versus in software. So you got to take your previews and your histograms with a bit of a grain of salt. I mean, that being said, they can be useful, and it does, definitely pay benefits to be, checking and paying attention to what is on the camera as you're shooting. And of course, again, if you can't nail the exposure, then you can bracket. And this means just, capturing a frame or two a little bit underexposed and a frame or two a little bit overexposed. And between the whole set of them, along with the metered exposure, hopefully you'll have the ideal exposure. So now we get into editing a shoot. So you've done all your captures, you've downloaded them onto your computer, you've made your backups, And now you're going to get into your editing software and look through your photos and pick the best ones. And so when I talk about editing at this stage, I mean editing in terms of evaluating, ranking and rating and filtering them down, and using the stars and the color labels and the pick flags and all the attribute tools that you have in order to identify which are your best pictures. At this point, then, you need to start thinking about how you can get things into collections. And I'm going to show you some, I'll demonstrate this in just a minute in terms of how to do this in Lightroom, which I think really is a big help, especially if you're shooting a lot and working with a lot of images. That also applies to virtual copies, which essentially can only be done in software like Lightroom or other database-driven editing tools where you can make a copy in the software without actually making a copy of the original photo on disk. And derivatives are something that we're going to talk a little bit more about when we look at our printing workflow. A derivative is just a variation, an extra copy on disk or as a virtual that you have created from your master. And a derivative would be made for a specific purpose. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. So this is our post-processing workflow, and I'm going to go through this all with you next in Lightroom. So the workflow basically starts, with the idea that we're going to do the biggest changes first, which means make your adjustments that are affecting the entire image, and that's what we call global. So you're making your global adjustments, and then you work your way gradually to your local adjustments. So start with the big changes, work your way down to the minutia, and you want to try and use a consistent sequence like that, which is what I've got listed out here next. Now, I understand that you're not going to do every picture exactly the same way, and in all honesty, even I don't always follow these exact same steps. But especially if you're just getting used to the digital photography workflow, then following a list like this is going to help you get faster at your editing. It's going to ensure that you're not, skipping or forgetting anything. And it's also going to give you a roadmap. It's good to start with a plan. And as you get more experienced and, have more comfort with everything that you need to do, of course, then, naturally you can start to jump around a little bit more with this. One of the best things about working with something like Lightroom or a non-destructive editor, where in Lightroom, for example, any of this stuff can be adjusted and changed or redone or the effect removed at any point. So there is no risk of changing or damaging your original photo. And so the order that you do these things is more kind of for your own benefit to make sure that you're covering all your bases. And, in certain cases, there are some adjustments that are going to affect others. And you obviously don't want to be making one adjustment that's going to require you to make another adjustment to correct for it. But aside from that, really, you can go back and forth within this sequence of steps in order to refine and perfect each image. So the first thing we'll do is cropping and straightening, fixing distortion and aberration. These are things that are caused by the lens, especially in the case of lens distortion, like perspective distortion. Chromatic aberration is something that you'll need to check for in every image. Then you want to move on to optimizing your tones. And by tones, I mean from your black point to your white point and all the levels of brightness in between. Tones are different than color. And you will find a lot of times that if you've got images that are a little under or overexposed, that once you get your tone and your contrast kind of where you want it, then a lot of times the color will start to fall into place as well. So you do want to be thinking in terms of setting your range of tones, your black and white point, before moving on to color. Then as we're working through these steps, you get to the local adjustments. And by this, I mean what would traditionally be referred to as dodging and burning, where you're going in and lightening or darkening very specific areas. And this, could also start to include things like retouching and, the minutia. At some point in the process, you need to check every image for noise and the effects of sharpening and see how you can bring out, just the right amount of detail without increasing or introducing noise. Most images, can benefit from some amount of sharpening in your digital processing workflow. Once you've done all of these things, then is the right time really to be thinking about, maybe converting to black and white or applying special color effects and things like this. But, all of the fundamental technical stuff really should be done, before moving too much into the really creative things. And then towards the end of the workflow then is where you're thinking more about composites, and this could be done for like photo montage or creating kind of composite illustration kind of effects, as well as HDR or high dynamic range composites. Although very often your HDR workflow may actually involve a composite blend, early in the workflow, and then optimizing tone and color afterward. After you've gone through and fine-tuned and adjusted each image to where you're happy with it, then we're going to look at preparing for print. So here we are in Adobe Lightroom, which is my preferred software for editing my photos. I would point out at the beginning here that a lot of what I'm going to show you can also be done in Adobe Camera Raw, which comes with Photoshop. So I mentioned about the photo editing process. So here I have a folder full of images that I have collected together, and I need to go through and make some selections as to which are the ones that I want to work with. So my editing process involves using the attributes, or in this case stars, and going over in multiple passes using filters to narrow down my selection. So to start, I'll go through and I'll just assign 1 star to images that I think I want to keep. Now here's 2 images that are very similar, and I'm not ready yet to decide between the two, so I'll just select them both. I'll give this a star and this a star. I'm doing this just sort of randomly to show you the process here, but the idea is that since I'm not yet sure which images that I'm going to want to keep from this edit, then I'm going to go ahead and give a star to any that I think might move forward in the workflow. Early in your workflow and your editing stages, if it's a maybe, then I would say it's a yes. As you go further into your edits, if it's a maybe, it's got to be a no, because what you're doing is gradually getting more and more strict in your criteria and refining your selections. So I'm just going through and picking the ones that I think I might want to continue working with. Now, if you were just starting with a whole batch of images that you would just shot, of course, you'd have a lot more that look very similar. I assembled these photos, obviously, from a range of other trips at different times, but you get the idea. Okay, so I've given all the ones a single star that I think I like, I want to keep, I'm going to move forward in the workflow. So then I'll apply a 1 star filter. So now I'm only seeing the ones with 1 star. And you can see down here, I've gone from 69 photos to 38 photos. Okay, so you can imagine that even if you have hundreds or thousands of photos to get through, using this method, you really can pare them down quite quickly. Okay, so now at this point, in this stage of the edit, I think I might want to choose between these two. This is a 4:5 crop. This is a 2:3 crop ratio. I think I actually like the wider one better, so I'm going to give it the 2nd star. I'll keep this one in play. I'll keep this one. Again, I'm not going too much into my criteria for selecting these. You would be looking for things like composition and sharpness and, does it tell the story that you want to tell? Does it say what you want to say? if the photo just falls short, in so many ways, then you just don't move it forward in the workflow. Okay, so I've given these 2 stars, filter for 2 stars. Okay, and I'll go through again. Let's say 3 stars. So I'm giving the 3rd star to the images that I want to keep. And I apologize that we don't really have time today for me to go too much into my methodology or rationale of why I would choose one image over another. But that certainly is something that we can cover in other sessions. Okay, so now I've gone from 69 photos down to 11. Okay, and just using the stars and the attribute filters. So at this point then, I want to be able to save this selection so I can easily access it later, so I don't have to be always using the filters. If I turn off my filters, you can see here are all the photos, including, the ones with 3 stars, 1 star, no stars, right? They're all still in here, but with the filter, the attribute filter on, I'm only seeing the ones with 3 stars. So I'm going to select all of them, use the Command A, or select all, and then I'm going to make a new collection by clicking on this little plus sign, create collection, and we'll just call these Nat's Faves. Sorry, I'm typing with one hand here, so bear with me. Okay, and include selected photos. So now I've got all of these photos saved away in a collection. It didn't make any copies of these on disk, right? We're still dealing with the same original photos. It's just Lightroom has created another grouping of them. You can imagine that using collections this way, you can create subgroups for any type of purpose. I mean, I have many hundreds or, gosh, I don't know, thousands of collections in my catalogs, for all purposes: portfolios, exhibitions, print projects, books, client work, anything you can imagine, you can make a collection for. So now that I have gone through and made my selections, I want to go through and start processing these. So just again, sort of randomly, I'll go ahead and pick this image and we'll go into the develop module. Now you can see I've got the left panel hidden here. I like to keep as much room available for my preview. I normally would also maybe reduce the size of the thumbnails, maybe hide and show the right panel. Try and keep as much room as you can for seeing the actual image. So in terms of working this image sort of, start to finish, starting with our list, cropping, I'm quite okay with the composition, in general. I don't think it needs any huge cropping done to it, but it does look like it could use a little bit of straightening. And so I'll do that using the crop tool in Lightroom. And so I'll just bring up the crop overlay and just click the corner to rotate it a little bit and then hide the crop tool when I'm done. Now, this is one of the best parts of using Lightroom or other types of metadata-based editors, is that anything, including cropping, can be done or redone any number of times, right? If I bring up the crop tool again, you can see all of the original image data is still there. The file on disk has not been modified at all. So I could change the crop like this. I could change it like this. At any point, I can go back and edit this crop, because all of these adjustments are being made within the Lightroom catalog, and the original file on disk remains untouched. So working next through our, sorry, let me just put this back to where I sort of had it. Working back to our list of adjustments, the next thing I would deal with is tone. Now, if we look at the histogram, you can see all of the tones are kind of bunched up here in the middle. This image is kind of lacking contrast. It's a little bit flat. You can see it's in very diffuse, sort of overcast kind of light. So one of the first things I want to do is just add a little bit more punch and a little bit more contrast to it. So I can do that by bringing up the whites little bit up on the highlights. I think that is making it look a little bit too brassy. So I'm going to bring down the exposure just the tiniest bit. I will bring down the blacks, give those some nice punch, and then I'll bring up the contrast. Now at this point, I can do a before and after. So you can see that, you know, with a very quick set of pretty minor adjustments, you really start getting, you know, a much nicer looking image. And, you know, at this point, if I wanted to adjust the vibrance or the saturation, you know, to increase or decrease the amount of color, you know, I could do that. But I think I'm feeling pretty okay about the way the colors look in this image. I like to, you know, keep the colors looking pretty natural and, you know, as it was, you know, to my eye when I saw it. Now, the exception to that might be that if I opened up this image and let's say the white balance was way off, like if I had put an in-camera white balance setting where maybe it was too warm or maybe it was too cool, you know, if you open up an image and you've got issues with the white balance, that is a very major global adjustment. So it stands to reason that maybe you would, you know, tackle adjusting that a little bit before even moving on to your tones. But in general, you do want to think about adjusting your tonal range, setting your blacks and whites and your contrast before moving on to color. And you'll find that most of the time, if you can get your tones right, then the color starts looking pretty good too. All this talk about color, saturation, and white balance and everything raises the question of how do we trust what we see on the screen? There's really no point going to great lengths to adjust an image if you can't really have any confidence that what you're seeing on your computer screen is actually correct for what's in your image file. So this all has to do with color management. And to get the best results from your prints, you absolutely need to be following good color management practices. These problems are very common, but they can be solved relatively easily if you use the right equipment and procedures. So the solution comes down to using a calibration device. In this case, I'm showing the X-Rite i1 Studio and the i1 Display. You need to have a device to measure your screen or your printed output or whatever you're calibrating for. You can't just do it by your eye, and unfortunately, you can't just do it in software either. Now, I wholeheartedly recommend the color management solutions from X-Rite. You may know them more from their very popular products, the product line of the color checkers. But the X-Rite i1 series of color management devices are the only ones that I recommend. A lot of the other ones that are on the market just do not provide accurate results, whereas the i1 systems are very, very good. Real quick, again, we don't have enough time really to get too deep into this. I mean, I do webinar sessions and, you know, entire courses on color management because this stuff can become quite technical. But it's enough that you at least know that, you know, your computer itself has a color management system built into it. Depending on whether you're using Mac or Windows, it may be called something different. On the Mac, it's Color Sync. And a color space describes how many colors are possible. So this means that a device has a color space, like your monitor or a printer, for example, but image files also can have color spaces associated with them. A large color space means there's a lot of colors possible, and a smaller color space means that those colors actually don't physically exist. So the goal of color management is to translate the colors from your image, you know, through the imaging pipeline so that what you're seeing on screen effectively is as close as possible to what comes on the printed output. So to get accurate prints, and by accurate I mean that what comes out of the printer is what you expect. I mean, you have to understand that you're never going to get a truly exact screen to print match because a screen is a transmissive device where it's, you know, putting out light, And a print is a reflective thing where, how the print looks is entirely dependent on the quality of the light, in the ambient light in the environment, and how it's reflected off a sheet of paper. But I can tell you that if you calibrate and profile your screen and you're using good printer profiles, then you definitely can expect to get pretty close screen to print match, at least close enough that you can predict accurately how the print will come out. But to start, you do need to use a good display. And unfortunately, I have to say that if you spend just, $100 or even a couple £100 on a consumer grade computer monitor, that is never going to be accurate in terms of showing you the true colors of what's in your photographs. Realistically, you need to be looking at sort of the £500 to £600 range, or the equivalent number in dollars, if you really are trying to do good quality photographic work. So you got to start with a decent display, and then also you need to make sure not to set it too bright. The biggest problem that I see sort of across the board is that a lot of people will unknowingly set their monitor brightness far too high, and then of course when you make a print, well, the print looks a lot darker, simply because what you're seeing on your screen is not correct or accurate as to what's actually in your image file. So starting with a good display, setting it to a correct brightness, calibrating and profiling it, those things in and of themselves will get you 90% of where you need to be for getting an accurate print. Soft proofing is something we'll look at very briefly in just a minute, where you can actually simulate on screen what a print might look like on a given printer and paper combination. And then you need to be using good quality printer profiles. And by using the correct ones, I mean most often you can get printer profiles from whoever made the paper, or whoever is sourcing the paper. So if you're using Epson, for example, they provide printer profiles for all of their media. So you need to use the correct and good quality profiles as well. So now we're ready to get into photo printing. So we've gone through a quick edit and some develop adjustments in Lightroom a little bit earlier. And now we are at a place where we're ready to make a print. So we'll just quickly go through, establish some of the basic goals, what we're trying to accomplish in our printing. First and foremost, especially in terms of photography as art, we're trying to maintain the best possible quality. But we also don't want to take too long doing it. Speed is important, and you will find that the more that you do these things, obviously, the more efficient you'll get at it. We need to keep our print workflow non-destructive, as I was referencing earlier with the cropping example, and any of the other adjustments you'd make in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. You need to be able to change your mind or adjust things as the need arises. You need to have repeatable results. And by this, I mean that if you make a print today that you're happy with, you need to be able to replicate that result, 6 months or, years from now, and have a high degree of confidence that the result will be as good every single time. That being said, you need to still have some room for improvement. And as the equipment improves, as your methods and your skills improve, as you're capturing better images, it is reasonable that as time, your print should keep getting better and better. Quick overview of our printing workflow. We're going to finalize the master file. And, for the most part, what we were looking at in Lightroom, that would be considered our master file, where you've got your original, you're making your adjustments directly to it. We are not going to make any adjustments or changes to our master file specific for any given print job. You need to work up the master file so in and of itself you're pleased with it, and then you would use derivative copies or separate print files depending on the print job that you're doing. So you need to first finalize that master file where you're happy with it on your calibrated and profiled screen. You need to decide on the size that you're going to print, and you do have a couple of different sizes to consider here. One is the live image, or how the printed ink sort of sits on the paper, and then you have the sheet size. So depending on whether you're using a cut sheet or a roll feed media, there is some maths involved, and you need to kind of be clear on the sizes that you're working with. Choosing your media, which we'll look at in just a minute, is going to be down to not only budget and what may be immediately available, but you want to be thinking in terms of picking each paper or canvas or whatever is your type of media should be a good match for the image itself. Now, preparing print files, especially if you're using these derivative copies I'm talking about specifically for each job, this opens up a possibility that you can make some adjustments specifically for a given print condition. And I'm going to demonstrate this for you in just a second. Going through your page setup and printer driver settings, this should be something that you do enough to get, a sort of a routine and a set of habits that you can repeat, again and again. But realistically, you got to check every one of these settings each time that you go through the job, because you never know if something has been reset to the default or if maybe something has been left from another print job. So I'm going to go over that with you. Checking the printer setup in terms of ink levels, doing a nozzle check, and then after you've done all these things, then you will cue the job for the output. So here we are in the Lightroom print module, and I have this image that we had worked up in the develop module previously. I'll just use this as our printing example. So within the print module in Lightroom, the first thing always to do is check your page setup. And I do this first because your paper and page size here, as well as things like orientation and scale, that is also fundamental to getting set first, because then that is what will lead to all of the other measurements and the settings that you would apply in the layout panel. So the first thing, of course, is to choose the correct printer. And I've got selected here the Epson P900. I almost always try and print in portrait orientation, which sometimes means making a page setup that is wider than it is tall. For example, if I'm using a canvas or a roll feed type of media, but printing in portrait orientation always makes things a lot easier, because this is generally the way that your paper is going to be feeding through, with the the short side is feeding through the printer. So again, I'll first select the printer, because a lot of the paper options and sizes will be driven by what printer is selected. For this example, maybe I'll just change from A3 and I'll just shift it to A2. Now, A2 is a sheet, and it's going to be using default margins. You can see that a lot with the Epson P900 and P700, the current series of papers provide a lot of different options for how the papers are being fed through, and that's actually selected first here in the page setup. So that's very important, that if you're using, for example, the front paper feeder, that you would select that here. Really important, because the rest of your settings and the printer control panel stuff is going to be all driven by this selection. Make sure that we set the scale to 100, because we're going to have Lightroom, or in the case of Photoshop, which I'll show you next, we'll have the apps can actually be establishing the scale, but we want in page setup, it's going to be going 100%, and we're going to use portrait orientation. So I'll click OK there. Now that I have set the page size to A2, the rest of the setup in Lightroom has to do with how the image or multiple images may be positioned on the page. In this case, you can see on the toolbar here, I've got just to use selected photos, and I only have the one photo selected. But if I select multiple photos, then you see that I end up with a print job with multiple pages. Okay, so I can actually select multiple images here, and then Lightroom will output each one on its own page. That's only because of the way that these settings are placed. If I wanted to put, for example, 4 images on one sheet of paper, then over here on the layout grid, now I actually skipped over one part. I want to make sure you understand this. I am using what's called the single image or context sheet layout style. In a lot of ways, this is the simplest, most straightforward way to lay out a sheet. And especially if you really are just printing one image, then it's going to be a lot easier just to use this one rather than these packages, which are designed for printing multiple photos at multiple sizes. So with a single image or contact sheet, all of the images, whether it's one or more, on a given sheet of paper are going to be at the same size, which for our purposes here is perfectly fine. So to place these multiple on one page, all I have to do is change our page grid. So you see now where before I had 4 pages with one photo on each page. Now it's one sheet of paper with 4 images. And then from here, you can just adjust the spacing. Now you can also double click and enter in very precise values here. And most of the time, if I'm being careful and, printing a, proper job, then I will absolutely be super careful and, trying to do my maths as best as I can and add things up here so that your sizes are exactly right. Now, the most important thing in a layout like this, of course, is going to be what's called the cell size. And down here at the very bottom, this is saying the height and the width. So each of these images then is in a box, effectively controlled by this sizing. So you'll note that we're not seeing any guides currently. If I go down here to the guides panel, I can show the guides. And now you can see how each of these images is placed within its respective cell. I'm just going to go back to 1 image per page. And we're going to say we want to print this, say, at 15 inches high by 10 inches wide. Okay, so you just type that in exactly. Now you can change your ruler units up here. So if you're more comfortable working in metric, then choose that here. Otherwise, in most cases, I will enter in a specific size here and then adjust the margins depending on this size. But it is possible though, if you start changing these, then depending on the size of your sheet of paper and your margins and how it all adds up, you see how it's starting to change here. So you really got to keep an eye on that. And so the main thing is to set your size and see when I try and put 15 back in, well, it won't let me because these margins up here actually, kind of override everything. So what if I just put these all to their minimum? Every printer is going to have kind of its own defaults for what's the minimum margins, but then at least I can put in what is the exact size, and you'll see that Lightroom places it in the center on the sheet. So for all intents and purposes, this print job is ready to go, right? I mean, let's say we're happy with 10 by 15 inches on an A2 sheet. We've already done the page setup and selected the printer and the paper size. We've set the layout. Just close these panels, and next you go down to the print job panel. Now, first and foremost, we do not want to be using draft mode because, as the name implies, that's not best quality. That's just going to be a very quick, low-resolution preview. Make sure that you have selected that it is going to the printer rather than to a JPEG file. Now, print resolution may be a little bit confusing. If this box is checked, then Lightroom will resample or resize the images using this number of pixels per inch for each image, regardless of what the original native resolution may be. If this is unchecked, then Lightroom will send the print job to the printer using whatever resolution it ends up being. Okay, so I think in most cases, unless you're absolutely sure of the resolution this image would be at this size, you're probably better off just leaving that checked. And then on Epson printers, 240 is kind of our sweet spot. That's ideal. Sometimes I may go up to 360, but that is extremely rare. Most of the time I'll do 240. Now, those are multiples of kind of magic numbers that just nicely match up with the arrangement and the sizing and alignment of the piezo print heads, the nozzles on the Epson printer. So 240 is kind of our sweet spot there. Print sharpening, I would always add some print sharpening depending on the image and how much it's being enlarged and what's the resolution. Standard is fine. You can choose between matte or glossy media type. Matte is going to be a stronger amount of sharpening than glossy. And then 16-bit output. Again, we don't have enough time really to get too deep into this, but if your image is 16-bit or it's RAW and your printer driver supports 16-bit, then on some images, having 16-bit, can provide a better quality, potentially, maybe in smooth gradations, like in this type of area. But for most images, for example, like this image, you would never see a difference whether or not it was printed as 16-bit or not. So I generally don't bother with 16-bit output. The rule of thumb is if you don't need it, leave it unchecked. So next we'll go down to the color management section of the print job panel. This is one of the most important parts of setting up the print job in Lightroom. First, we want to make sure that Lightroom is using the correct printer profile to output this job. We do not want it managed by printer. This means that the color management is going to happen through a printer profile. Now, apologies that this menu is cut off, but you can see here that there are a few printer profiles in this menu that had been registered previously. If I click Other and then open this window, we can see these are all of the printer profiles that are registered on this system. And so let's say if I want to use luster photo paper, then I would check the box here, click OK, and now you see Lightroom has loaded that profile. This is the best way to ensure correct color management, not letting the printer manage it. Now, the rendering intent, for most jobs, I use relative. The only time I might use the perceptual intent is when there's some very maybe saturated colors or color relationships between very saturated colors. So if you're really into fine-tuning your color management, you owe it to yourself to learn a little bit more about how perceptual and relative rendering intents work. But most of the time, I will use relative. I do not apply any print adjustment here. These controls are very crude, and they're really, not a replacement for using correct color management procedures, especially if you've got a good quality computer display and it's been profiled and calibrated correctly. Then using the correct profile, this should give you a good match. So you should not have to be doing much down here in terms of print adjustment. Now that I have selected the color management options and chosen the profile, next I will go to the printer dialog box here. And when I click the printer button, this brings up the print driver panel. The software and the options that you actually are seeing in this section are all provided by the Epson printer driver. Okay, so the first thing, I have gone down to printer settings, and we want to choose the type of photo paper. Now, on the latest versions of Epson printers, if you choose use printer settings, then the media type actually is determined on the printer itself using the control panel. But we can choose photo paper luster, print quality. Let's just say quality options. This gives you a range of slider adjustments here, so you can choose. Now, for almost every photo, 1440 is going to be totally appropriate. Black Enhance Overcoat is a black boost, effectively, that are with the latest versions of Epson printers. This is an option that lays down some additional gray inks, actually, that will give deeper shadows. High speed means that the printer head will print on both passes as it's going across. Pretty much I'll always just leave finest detail, but these are the settings really that you want to see, that the media type is either selected by the printer, or if you've got an older printer, then you have no choice but to just make your best selection here. Now, as long as this matches up with what you've chosen as your profile, then you should be good to go. And when you go down here and go through some of these other options, again, all of these settings are being controlled by the printer driver itself. If you click on Advanced Color Settings, you'll see that we are using Color Sync. So this is a correctly color managed job. If you come in to your print dialog box and you see anything other than this, then something is wrong. And if you're using the Mac, it could be that that your printer is set up to use AirPrint, and that's not the correct way to do it. I would recommend that you do a little research and learn about how you need to install the correct Epson driver settings, and never ever use AirPrint on Mac. These are the settings that you should see when you come into the print dialog box. And at this point, then, I am ready to click the print button and send the job to the printer. Now, to print this photo in Photoshop, it takes a different set of steps. So here we have the image opened in Photoshop. And before I go into the print screen, I think I will spend just a quick minute showing you the soft proofing option that I mentioned earlier. So under the View menu, if I choose Proof Setup and then Custom, you'll see that this window comes up that allows me to preview on screen what this image will look like when printed to a certain printer using a certain paper. Here's some that I have saved from before. So if I go to Premium Luster, then you can see that Photoshop is simulating on screen what this image would look like on my Epson 9890 using Epson Premium Luster. And then you can see there's a preview box here we can check and uncheck. So you can see that in the soft proof condition, it's a little bit duller, or not as vibrant and saturated. The color is maybe a little bit cooler. There's a little bit of a blue tint. It's not as contrasty. There is one option here that isn't on by default, though, and that's this Simulate Paper Color. That is really important to have on, because you'll see that without simulating the paper color, there really is not much difference at all in your on-screen preview. I mean, you really need to be seeing what is the color of the paper. Now, all of this really is preempted by the need for having your screen calibrated and profiled. If you're not able to trust what you see on screen, then doing a soft proof like this really is not going to be any good. There's no point in doing it unless you have a very accurate display. But presuming that you've used one of the X-Rite products and calibrated, profiled your monitor, and you've set your brightness correctly, then I can tell you that using this soft proof is a really good way to train your eye to seeing how the image will look when it's printed under these conditions. Now, here again is the rendering intent, just like in Lightroom, and you can choose between perceptual and relative, and you can see an on-screen preview of how each of those would look. Now, Lightroom does also have soft proofing in it, and when you soft proof in Lightroom, one of the options is that you can create a proof copy of the image so that you can make adjustments directly onto it. And this gets back to using a derivative files where you're proofing to a certain condition, and then maybe you want to make some slight adjustments, like maybe I'd want to pump up the contrast or increase the saturation or take a little bit of that blue hue out. You would do all of those types of adjustments using your softproof, but you'd have to be doing that on a copy. Again, because we're not going to modify our master file just for this one print job, because there's nothing that says you might not be using a different printer or a printer model or a different paper or some other conditions in the future. So you need to leave your master file intact and only do your softproofing and any edits based on softproofing using copies of the files. Okay, so I'm just going to cancel out of this. So we're back to our normal preview here. Now, to print from Photoshop, I'll go under the File menu and go to Print. Now, this brings up the print window. Let me just fit it into the screen here. Okay, so you can see that the print setup is quite different. So the first thing, again, I need to choose my Epson P900. Then, just like in Lightroom, we need to choose that for color handling, we don't want the printer managing the color. We want Photoshop managing the color, and we want to choose the correct printer profile. And we'll do it exactly the same as we did in Lightroom, where you have the profile selected in here. So now Photoshop will send this print job to the printer using the settings contained within this profile. Okay. Now you notice the size. You can see that the image is cut off and it's not positioned correctly on the paper. One of the tricky things about printing from Photoshop, I'm just going to cancel here quickly. One of the tricky things about printing from Photoshop is that you really want to size and rotate and set everything on your image file to exactly what it is that as you want to print it before you actually open that print window, so that what you're sending through the print screen is that you're not doing any enlargement or rotation or anything like that in the print window. You need to do it on this image for the most reliability. So to do that, I'll go under the image size, and just using our example that we did in the last one, I want to use 15 by 10 inches at 240 pixels per inch. I'm going to use resampling, and I'll just put this on automatic. That's usually your best bet. So 10 by 15 inches, 240 pixels per inch. Let Photoshop resample this image, and there we go. So I'll just zoom in a little bit here. All right, so the other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, I always like to print in portrait orientation. So to do that, I'm actually going to rotate this. So if I go under the image rotation, 90 degrees clockwise. Okay, and I'll just fit this into the window. Okay, so this is actually how I'm going to print this job, right? And the reason I do this is because the positioning and scaling of an image in Photoshop using these controls is really unpredictable and very difficult, and you'll waste a lot of time and a lot of paper and ink. So if you just size it to what you want, maybe sharpen it. I didn't do any additional sharpening. I'd probably do one pass of unsharp mask print sharpening on here before going into here. At this point then, because I have selected my printer profile, I'm just positioning it central on the page. I've got the correct printer chosen here. If I go into print settings, then at this point, when I choose my paper size, and again, if I go down to these same options as what we saw in Lightroom, that I can use the printer settings, or I can use luster photo paper, print quality, right? So it's exactly the same. Uncheck that. That black enhance overcoat is probably best only for certain types of images. But this is what you want to see, and it really does look exactly like in the print driver in Lightroom, and it's because we are actually looking at Epson sort of software here. This is provided by the printer manufacturer, not by your print software, but not by Photoshop or Lightroom. This is printer driver stuff. So you would always set this up the same way. And this is what I meant earlier when I was talking about, having a sequence of steps. The way that you set up your print job in the printer driver here, the only things really that you would be changing is your media type, maybe on rare occasion, the resolution or the quality, right? And maybe some of this stuff, but this is all like minor adjustments. Whereas as long as you've got the correct media type selected here, and as long as you have Photoshop managing the color with the profile here, your color will be accurate. And at this point then, I can print the job. So back to choosing media. We've looked at quite a few different types of images, and I've showed you, quite a few of the different paper types, the different media, printer profiles. And you have a huge range of options to choose from. So sometimes it's kind of hard to know, what's going to be the best paper for a given image. So here's my thoughts on just, some general guidelines. So glossy paper, like, your traditional or your standard kind of photo papers, really are going to be best for very sharp photos containing smooth, solid colors and lots of fine detail. I think like crisp edges and images maybe that have reflections in them as well. Luster papers, or semi-gloss, sometimes they're called, you probably have the widest range of choices here with luster papers, and that's with good reason, because really when you think about the range of images that you might have in your archives, when you're making prints, luster is going to be the most sort of all-round best choice. It's going to work with the widest range of types of images. I really like Epson traditional photo paper, which has a Baryta coating, which is a surface treatment, a layer that gives a really lovely kind of luster and really, a very luminous kind of look to the print surface, but also that it's got a fiber base. I'm not a huge fan of papers that are very sort of plastic and synthetic. So even if I'm using a photo paper, I prefer papers that have kind of a natural organic feel to them. Now, fine art papers like watercolor, or even a very smooth, bright white fine art paper, they're very matte finish, right? So they don't have any kind of gloss or surface reflection to them. So they're really nice for, a more arty kind of a look. These days, though, I probably print the majority of my images on canvas, partly because I do sort of large format, wall hanging artworks, especially with my abstracts. But even with pictures with a lot of detail, the surface texture of canvas sometimes can really bring out and enhance the appearance of some of that detail. You do have a lot of other choices too. These four listed at the top, they're kind of just sort of your standard everyday kinds of media. But you can get metallic photo paper. I even have printed on some metallic canvas, which is just gorgeous. You can print on fabric, and I'm just talking, with regular inkjet printers here, like that you could have at home. You can print on fabric. Epson makes a really nice paper called Japanese kozo. That's kind of like a rice paper sort of a feel. So let me give you some examples. So this one, I think, looks best on a fine art paper, right? Because any sort of a surface finish or texture really sort of interferes with the sky here and starts to become distracting. So although I have printed this on canvas, and the sand, actually, the lower part of this picture looks nice on canvas, but the upper part really, because of those smooth, very soft pastel areas, any sort of texture really shows through there, so it's distracting. So I would put this on a fine art matte finish paper. This one looks really good on glossy paper because, the surface of the reflection is glossy itself. So this is a good match for something more like traditional photo papers. This looks nice on a luster paper as well. And I actually have printed this on fine art paper also. But I think this is a good example of when you've got a clear reflection like this, then this is one that maybe a glossy paper could be a good fit. This one looks really good on canvas because the surface texture works with the detail in the image and really makes it quite lifelike. This one, again, some of my more recent abstract work, this one I like to print on metallic surface paper, whether it's a metallic photo paper or metallic canvas, or even actually printing directly to metal, which I do have to outsource that I can't print those on my regular Epson printers because that requires a flatbed sort of a process. But printing directly on metal looks amazing on this one. And that brings us to exhibition. So we've gone all the way through the workflow. We've captured our images, downloaded, edited them. We have processed them. We have printed them. And now it's time to share them with the world. So you have a huge range of choice when it comes to exhibiting your work around your local area or even wider. I for many years have done a lot of art fairs and sort of craft fairs and festivals and things like this. You can tell by the grass and the marquee here that this is sort of a craft fair type of environment, which is a great place to start. I mean, honestly, it's not difficult to hire a booth space at one of these. This is the Foxton Locks Festival here in England. And as you can see, this was done inside a marquee, which, definitely is nice to be sheltered from the environment. I have to admit the grass maybe does detract a little bit from the presentation, but you can see here that I've got, some, portable modular grid wall systems, some stands and, things that you can set up and take down, to cart the stuff around. If there's a challenge with doing fairs and festivals, it is the logistics and the damage that can occur from transporting these things. Obviously you've got a lot of cost involved, not just in producing the work, but even in your hanging and display systems, and especially if you buy your own marquee, which a lot of artists do, and that is a very well-defined model. For exhibiting and even selling your work. It's not for the faint of heart. Local restaurants, when I first moved here to the UK from Colorado, my wife Ruth had a friend who she grew up with who ended up owning a restaurant in Leicester. And, being new to the country, I was always looking for places where I could hang my work. And I had produced a set of canvases that was in a gallery show, and the pieces that I had left, I had asked if I could just hang them in the restaurant for a couple of months. So depending on the type of restaurant or venue and the type of clientele, hanging your work in a restaurant or other type of hospitality space really can be a great solution for getting your work out into your wider community. This is the Oxford International Art Fair, which was held at the Oxford Town Hall. This was a couple of years ago now. And this is one, again, where you hire the booth space or hire a stand, and you got to transport all the work there. But this shows a lot of my large format canvases hanging in place. And this was quite a successful show for us. Sales were good, certainly enough to cover our costs and then some. But again, just like with the art fairs, the logistics of this are challenging, and it's also these types of fairs are not cheap to get into. So, it really is something that you have to be committed to on a number of levels. This was an exhibition that I did at a hotel in Nottingham quite a few years ago now. I had this body of work, and it was kind of a retrospective of my abstractions over a few years. And I had shown this at at a gallery in Leicester. And then following the success of that one, I was looking for other places to show. And I always like working with hotels along with restaurants. I mean, hospitality, again, is a really great match for presenting fine artwork. And this hotel called the St. James in Nottingham, they actually have their own sort of purpose-built gallery space, which was pretty handy. So, the show ran for about 6 weeks. I would say 4 to 6 weeks is a good amount of time, for mounting an exhibition and, having an opening reception and, have a few weeks of a run just to, make sure you get the maximum visibility. And then eventually, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I did open my own gallery and we've been had to be shut for a little while here during the lockdown, etc. But we will be opening again soon. And we are in Leamington Spa. So check out our website. And, when we open up again, be sure to pay us a visit. And as I also mentioned earlier, if you're a photographer and you're into producing your work as fine art, be sure to check out our conference coming up on April 17th. Here's a few ideas for some next steps for you. I know that, again, in a session like this, that we can't really cover everything. I mean, you could spend a lifetime learning this stuff. Maybe, as a suggestion, think about what I've covered today and identify some areas where you can see some improvement in your workflow and in your process. Hopefully you're making some prints of your work. I mean, if you're a photographer who has a lot of images that have never seen the light of day and they're really, sitting on your hard drive, well, you got to bring them out into the world. So, I'm a big believer in print. And so these steps and these kinds of workflows are, really a tried and true way of creating something tangible and valuable from your images. But if you look over your workflow and figure out, where there are some areas for improvement, you can start piecing these things together into, a process and a method that's very, very repeatable for you. Obviously, because I'm so into printing and have been for so long, I would be remiss not to encourage you to learn a lot more about printing and print your work as much as you can. There's a lot more events coming up like this with WEX. WEX is, really committed to the photo video community here in the UK. And these types of events are a great way to, to show support and build community. There's one that I've sort of identified. I've registered for this one. I thought was pretty interesting about mindfulness, mental health, and photography coming up on the 28th April. So be sure to check the WEX website. Follow WEX on social media and use the hashtag WEX Masterclass. If you've enjoyed today's session, I would certainly love, to hear your comments. You can post down below. I am going to be around for a little while for some Q&A if you want to ask any specific questions. But by all means, do look me up. I'm easy to find online. You can go to my website at natcoalson.com or my gallery website, or just do a quick Google search for Nat Coalson and, you'll be able to find me. So do get in touch. I wish you all the best with your photography, and stick around and let me know any other questions you have. Thanks so much.